All right, let's go ahead and kick off today. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited to cover the 1099 compliance track of the Wingspan account payable webinar series specifically for contractors. And today we're going to talk all about how to save time, money, and headache filing 1099 forms. And as a reminder, this is one track of a 3-track series of webinars. So if you work with a lot of contractors, we cover the full contractor lifecycle from onboarding, payments, and 1099 compliance at the end of the year. Like I said, today's all about 1099 compliance, but if these other areas are interesting to you, we highly encourage you to check out the onboarding and payment tracks, where we covered a lot of great information about how to handle those processes as it relates to working with contractors at scale. Just to kind of give you a sense for who you're talking to today and the folks that we have on the call, my name is David Henry. I'm the head of marketing here at Wingspan. I'm joined by Carrie Florian. She is our resident accounting expert. She's the senior accounting manager for us as a company, but she also brings a really in-depth set of experience working in the industry for over 15 years on both the accounting firm side as well as for direct companies. So we're super grateful that Carrie can bring some of her expertise to the table and help us work through some of these challenges that accounting and finance teams face on a regular basis. Carrie, feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone. It's great seeing some returning and new peers and colleagues. Excited to be hosting our third session, and hopefully it will be valuable time for everybody.
Great. So why are we talking about 1099s? I know it's August and everyone is just coming off vacation and getting ready to send the kids back to school, or maybe you just did. But we are, pretty well through the year. We've got 170 days until our January 31st deadline for 1099 filing. So a lot of what we're going to cover today is how to be a bit more proactive and organized so that window of time, from January 1 to January 31 is a straightforward process and not one where you are chasing down a bunch of information. And we're going to cover a lot of best practices as well as things to avoid to kind of prevent that headache around 1099 season that plagues so many accounting and finance teams that are out there. Just to kind of set the stage a little bit, I wanted to cover some of the different payment categories where 1099s are required. And the first is kind of the most obvious, but if you're making direct payments to an independent contractor, it could be cash, it could be a check, it could be an ACH transfer, what have you. You obviously want to keep track of that and make sure that you're filing a 1099 for those types of payments. In addition, indirect payments. So if you're paying a contractor through a payment processing company or on behalf of a contractor, these payments qualify as well as payments for goods and services. So if you're paying for materials and labor combined, for example, that is reportable. But the one kind of caveat that I'll add there is that payments made solely for goods do not require 1099. That might seem obvious, but just something to keep in mind. When goods and services are together, you want to report it. When goods are on their own, that's more of a procurement exercise and not necessarily a payment to an independent contractor. And the final piece is not employee compensation. So if you're paying any individual that is not a W-2 full-time employee, you want to keep track of that. Carrie, what are some of the other kind of scenarios that accounting teams should keep an eye out for as it relates to when, where, and why you should file that 1099?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're going to want to file for anything under $600. So it's only payments that were made in the calendar year over $600. Also, payments via credit card, PayPal, Venmo, those are going to be handled by those companies, those reportings, so they will be sent to the government from there. So you don't need to add those on. And in fact, that could cause a bit of a headache if you do add those onto your filing.
The one thing I'll add to that is if you're processing scaled payments out of those tools, it can be really difficult to manage. Just because they're more of a peer-to-peer payment system. So while you can technically process payment and they will file that 1099, it really starts to break down, especially for B2B payments that are done at a higher volume. If you're paying hundreds of thousands of contractors on an annual basis, probably not the way that you want to approach that, but we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go. There are essentially 5 different steps to a successful 1099 filing to keep in mind. The first one, we touched on this in the onboarding track and kind of the importance of making sure that you get the right information from your contractors up front to make the entire working engagement and compliance and tax filing process straightforward. And that really revolves all around getting that W-9. So make sure that it is accurate, make sure that you have a mailing address, make sure you have a TIN, and that TIN is verified, right? An error in the TIN can lead to really significant downstream effects. So if you're collecting a TIN, tax identification number, or a social security number from the independent contractor, you want to verify that with the TIN matching program so that you have a high degree of confidence that you have the right information up front. Note that is not something to do between January 1st and January 31st. This is stuff that you should do during that onboarding process. And then you want to actually kind of calculate your payments and get a sense for how much has been paid out through the calendar year. This is going to obviously require access to your payment records, but you specifically want to look at payments that are sent or paid out during that calendar year, not necessarily invoices that are received, which is, a nuance that really starts to matter for tax liability, especially if you're processing larger payments. So something to keep in mind, only keep track of payments keep track of all payments, but for the sake of 1099s, only keep track of the ones that were remitted during that calendar year itself. From there, step 4 is all about filing. So complete that 1099 NEC form, transfer the data from your records into that form as needed. Some cases you might want to validate that with a contractor and just make sure that you are ready to go on that front, and then you are ready to actually deliver that to the IRS. We highly recommend keeping 3 copies for these purposes. So copy A you want to send to the IRS. In some cases, you will need a state 1099 as well. So keep that in mind, that if your state requires it, you're going to want to submit it to them as well. Copy B, send to the contractor for their records so that they can go and file their taxes, and then maintain copy C for your records. This is particularly helpful for if you get a question down the line or a contractor is wondering where their 1099 is. It really helps to have an organized system of record to be able to access that information. Carrie, you've obviously handled this a bunch of times for a bunch of different firms. What are the gotchas as it relates to these steps, and how would you recommend that accounting and finance teams approach working through these as efficiently as possible?
Yeah, I mean, the number one step is going to be getting that onboarding right. If you have that W-9 and you've read through it, you have all the information you need, then you're going to have a much easier time to file those 1099s at the year end. And if you wait too long right before the deadline and then realize that you have missing W-9s or that they're incomplete, you're going to have a tougher time to file everything. Another note too is about delivery. One thing to note is that you have to be able to mail them out to contractors, and this they explicitly are allowing you to send it via email. And even then, I'd be careful about email. These are going to be, potential social security numbers. Sometimes I've used just, like a simple Dropbox or a Google Drive for them to access the information from.
Yeah, that's super valuable context, Carrie. And I think that ties neatly into some of the mistakes that accounting firms or accountants rather and finance teams might experience and how to avoid them. Can you walk us through some of those pitfalls and maybe give some kind of guidance on how to avoid the fire drills at end of year?
Sure. Again, talked about it before, but that incomplete W-9, at the end of the year when you're going to be filing everything, not having that information is really going to hold you up, or it's going to have you filing incomplete W-9s, 1099, which is not good. So make sure that you're giving yourself plenty of time before the filing date to review the W-9s and to make sure that you can contact the contractors in time to get anything updated you need. And then it gets really messy when you use multiple payment sources. So if you're paying somebody via wire, via a paper check, and then through an AP system, and then maybe, they needed a quick Venmo payment, it's going to get messy at year end to pull all that apart and to really calculate it. So we really stress simplifying how you pay the contractors to make it easier at year end. Also, just making sure that you understand what was invoiced versus what was paid to them during the year. You brought this up earlier, but this is where you can end up, reporting more than you actually paid the contractor, and they're not going to be happy about that. And, when you have all mistakes, you're going to get return notices from the IRS. You're going to get emails from the contractors. So getting all of this ready up front is going to help you in the end to not have that 1099 season go really long after the 1099 season.
Yeah, for sure. With independent contractors in particular, most of the time they're going to be paying 30 to 40% in taxes on that, which is why every dollar absolutely counts. I know as a W-2 employee, taxes are taken out automatically. You just don't really have to worry about tax liability, or definitely not as much as you would if, like, imagine you got that whole paycheck and then you were left with the bill at the end of the year. So accuracy there, obviously super important to kind of preserving the financial livelihood of the contractors that work for you. So I appreciate you sharing that, Carrie, and providing some context there as well. There are very real costs associated with messing up 1099 filing. So, not intended to scare anyone out of the room, but just to kind of clarify what's on the table here, there's penalties for inaccurate data or an inaccurate TIN on the form itself. This can be up to $310 per form that is filed, as well as late filing fees. So if you are delayed, you're past that January 31st date, there are fees between $60 and $630 per late 1099 form. And if you got one or two, that could be palatable. Obviously you want to avoid it, but once you get into the hundreds and thousands, that's when it becomes a very real issue. So we highly encourage finance and accounting teams to get their ducks in a row ahead of time to just prevent and mitigate any delays that might prevent them from filing on time. I think the piece that also becomes super important here is upset contractors. Carrie, what are kind of some examples of frustration that you might have heard from contractors, whether it's missing 1099, incorrect dollar amount, et cetera, and what's the blowback like for the accountants themselves that are dealing with these processes?
Yeah, no, all that you mentioned, and having that inaccurate number, as you stated, like, they're paying taxes against this. So you putting in a higher dollar amount is not going to make them very happy, as well as, snail mail. So sometimes they're going to be missing that, form in the mail, and they want to hurry up and file their taxes. So I get a lot of emails, where's my form? Where's my form? Where's my form? So it's important to get them sent out timely, just so that they can have it in time for filing them.
For sure. And I think too, real quick before we get to the next slide, I think with contractors as well, that, these are people that a lot of times don't have the same kind of safeguards that a full-time W-2 employee would have. And these can be sensitive topics. And ultimately what we want to mitigate is any pain that the contractor is feeling, and then any pain that's put on the accountant. We know it's not the accountant's fault that we're dealing with this issue, but oftentimes that can end up in your inbox. And that's just a situation that no one wants to find themselves in. So managing that up front is definitely going to go a long way to ease that process overall. And that brings us to extensions. So there are extensions available for 1099s. They do require you to be a bit proactive. We wanted to cover a few of the scenarios where that becomes more prevalent. One is catastrophic events. So there's a federally declared emergency, God forbid, that would qualify you for an extension. If your business operations were disrupted for something outside of your control, that can qualify as well. If you're missing information from the individual that's actually responsible for it, there's a few different scenarios. I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is that they all require either mailing or e-filing a form 108809 before the deadline. So keep that in mind. There are some exceptions. You want to make sure you're using form 8809 before that deadline to just make sure that you are not hit with any of those penalties. Obviously, there's something that folks want to avoid. This is the best way to go and do that. Not the biggest sticklers at the end of the day. You can't get an extension, but you don't want to be filing 1,000 different 8809s because you're a week late on calculating payments either. So just making sure that you take care of that is super important. Carrie, what are some of the different ways that accounting firms or accountants can file 1099s, and how do you think about the pros and cons across these kind of three different options here?
Sure. I mean, there's the old school method, which I have to say I did, which is, buying the forms and then setting them up in the printer and doing test prints and trying to get them to go right. And it's never easy. And then putting them in envelopes and getting them postmarked. Okay. So hopefully everybody's moved past that, but it is an option still. And then I've also used accounting firms where you gather up all of the information and you send it over to a firm who's going to go ahead and process those for you. And that works out, but you're still doing the bulk of the work yourself, in order to send the information for somebody just to file them. And then I've also used some online software tools that have worked okay, filing everything. And then honestly, one of the biggest reasons I came to Wingspan was just their solution of keeping track of all the payments, everything, sending them all out is great. So that's also a great resource.
Yeah, and I think that kind of calls out one of the key differences between using, maybe you're paying your contractors out of JustWorks or Rippling. You're using the same W-2 payroll system that you use to pay your employees as your contractors, but they don't necessarily have the right feature set to facilitate the various different stages of the contractor lifecycle, which, we think about as contractor management. And really this webinar is all around how do you onboard contractors? How do you pay them efficiently? How do you manage taxes and compliance at the end of the year? But we've taken, I would say, kind of a novel approach to that overall. And we have essentially a payroll platform that's purpose-built for contractor management. So when it comes to filing 1099s, this is something that we do in a fully automated fashion. It is included in the platform at no additional cost. And we automate the creation, reconciliation, filing, and delivery of those 1099 forms. This is going to give you a really solid system of records for both the filing of the 1099. So if you get a question about it later, you can pull it up really easily, as well as understanding what has been paid out for each individual contractor, which, we talked about the complexity of paying out on multiple systems and not having a centralized approach to this. Putting it all in one bucket is a much better way of handling the overall process than it is to spread it out across a bunch of different systems to essentially accommodate for contractors and their different needs and quirks and kind of the way that they prefer to work with you if they're kind of opting into different payment tools. The goal here, of course, is to provide a really seamless experience for contractors, but it is not to say that the accounting and finance teams don't benefit as well. So it's going to come down to efficiency. It's going to come down to headaches and ultimately from not creating that dumpster fire tax filing season that we all try to avoid. Carrie, I'm curious, how do you think about the difference between purpose-built tooling for this kind of use case versus more generalized, account payable or W-2 payroll software?
Yeah, I mean, you've made some good points already. And, when you're paying contractors at so you're talking about not just a handful, but 50, 100, even more, using systems like an AP system, JustWorks, they're going to break down and cause a lot of headaches for the accountant. Having a system that, from the moment that you decide to work with the contractor all the way through to the filing of the forms is just going to make everybody's life easier. And as an accountant, I love when my life is made easier. So,
yeah, of course. Great. Well, that's the content for today. 1099s are super important, and we wanted to make sure we cover the highlights for you all. So I'm going to open it up for some Q&A. Let me just dig in and see what questions we have to go and address. Just give me 1 second here. Okay. All right. One question, Carrie, this is a good one for you. What happens if you do make a mistake on a 1099 and realize after it's filed?
Yeah, that's not a problem. It's going to happen, right? You're going to have some incomplete information. Once you send it over to that contractor, they'll let you know that they never received a check you thought you had sent, so you have to redo it. You can send a corrected form. So you basically are sending the same form, but there's a button, there's a little box at the top or a button, depending on how you're filing it, for C, for corrected. And then you just go ahead and you file it for the new, for what it should have been. You don't file it for the difference. You file it all for a new form. And then the government will forget about the old one and just look at the corrected one. Okay, super helpful there. And one more, Carrie. Should I still file a 1099 if I don't have all the information? Yes. It's our obligation to send these out. And I've been there at times where I have just bugged the contractor nonstop for the information, and they're ignoring me. And, that's a good tip that, for the onboarding is sometimes I hold the payment until I get that W-9 filled out and have that in hand, because at the end of the year, you're not really going to have any leverage, especially if you're not working with that contractor again. So yes, you do need to file those, and the government's not going to be happy. They're going to send you a notice that it's missing information or inaccurate, but hopefully by the time you get that notice, you've finally gotten that contractor to give you the information, and then you can file a corrected one. But not filing can lead to those penalties. It's better to file with missing information than to just not do it at all.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the approach to hold payment until the information is collected, like that is your moment. Because once the payment goes out, people take their money and they go on with their lives. So, making sure you get that mailing address, TIN, verify it, you're good to go. That will make everything way easier. Thank you so much for sharing that, Carrie. Super helpful. That looks like it wraps up our questions for today. We did end early, but like I said, I encourage you to check out the rest of the series if you haven't. In addition, on the Wingspan blog, we also have a complete ebook for how to file 1099s. Happy to share that as well with the folks that have registered. But thank you so much for participating in our 3-part webinar series. And thank you, Carrie, so much for lending a hand and being super helpful here as we think through some of the key onboarding, payment, and tax filing milestones for managing contractors.
This has been a lot of fun. I hope we'll have some more in the future. Thanks, David.
Sounds great. Have a nice day.
And thanks, everyone. Bye.